The wind swept across the open plains like a restless spirit, bending the tall grass and sending waves rolling toward the horizon where the sun bled into the desert sky, turning everything copper and gold as if the land had been forged in a smithy's fire. And in the middle of that immense, hungry landscape stood a solitary ranch, the Rawlins Ranch, a place carved out of sweat, stubbornness, and the kind of hope a man clings to when he has nothing left to lose. And that man Elias Rawlins leaned against the post of his porch, staring at the dusty road that cut through the valley like a promise he desperately needed kept. Because today, after months of waiting, dreaming, and rehearsing the kind of gentle smile he barely remembered how to make, his mail-order bride was supposed to arrive, a woman named Clara Judson from the East, who wrote letters with such warmth and kindness that Elias had begun to believe God had finally decided he'd suffered enough. He could still hear her words in his mind, talking about how she longed to help build a home, how she wasn't afraid of hard work, how she wanted a fresh start with a man who'd value her gentle heart. And Elias, a rancher who'd lost more than most his family, his brother in the Apache wars, and his youth, to a land that took as easily as it gave, felt something he hadn't felt in years, the delicate, painful flicker of hope. He checked the sky again, adjusting his worn hat, his palms sweating despite the evening cool. And in the house behind him the table was already set with the best meal he could muster, a pot roast he'd worked on since sunrise, bread he'd nearly ruined 3 times, and a peach pie that he hoped would say everything he couldn't put into words. Because Elias wasn't good with talk or charm, he was good with horses, soil, and cattle, and he prayed that would be enough for a woman willing to cross a continent for him. The road remained empty for a long time, long enough that doubt crept into his chest like a slow leak, whispering that maybe she'd changed her mind, maybe she'd chosen a better man, maybe she realized she didn't want to marry some weather-beaten rancher in the middle of nowhere. But then, just as the sun slipped halfway behind the mountains, a dust cloud appeared at the far edge of the trail, moving slow and heavy, not like a stagecoach, not like any wagon he recognized, but like something large, very large, was approaching on foot. And Elias straightened, squinting into the dying light, his heart pounding, the hairs on the back of his neck rising because the silhouette emerging from the orange haze was not a woman in a travel dress, and it wasn't any man he'd ever seen before. The figure was massive, towering, broad-shouldered, wrapped in buckskin and adorned with painted symbols that glimmered faintly, even in the dusk. And when the stranger finally stepped into full view, Elias felt his throat go dry, because standing at the foot of his ranch was an Apache warrior, the biggest he'd ever laid eyes on, his height nearly brushing 8 feet, his chest like carved granite, his braids swinging past his ribs, and his obsidian eyes fixed on Elias with an expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't exactly friendly either. Elias instinctively reached for the rifle leaning beside the door, not to raise it but to know it was there. And the giant lifted one hand slowly in a gesture that usually meant peace, though on a man his size even peace looked dangerous. And then the warrior spoke, his voice deep, resonant, like stones grinding beneath a river, saying, "You are Rawlins." And Elias managed a stiff nod, asking who he was, why he was here, what he wanted. And the giant warrior stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the porch steps, and said something that made Elias forget how to breathe. "I come in place of the woman." And Elias stared, certain he'd misheard, but the warrior continued, telling a story in slow, heavy words that Clara Judson had never stepped foot on the stagecoach west because she'd been taken by bandits 3 days before departure, a small group of outlaws who sold travelers to slavers across the border, and that the Apache giant, whose name was Dakota, meaning friend of all, had stumbled upon their camp, freeing the captives. But Clara had been wounded, fevered, begging him, with what little strength she had, to deliver a message to the rancher who waited for her, to go in her stead because she feared she wouldn't survive the journey. And as Elias listened, his hands trembled, his stomach knotted, and his heart cracked, because Clara, the woman he'd imagined building a life with, was gone before he ever heard her voice. Dakota reached into the pouch at his side and produced a small folded paper, worn soft at the edges, stained with travel and struggle. And when Elias opened it, he recognized Clara's handwriting immediately, shaky but still hers, telling him she was sorry, that she wished things had been different, that Dakota had saved her from something worse than death, and she begged Elias to treat the warrior well because he had chosen to make the long journey in her honor, to fulfill the duty she could not. Elias felt the weight of the letter settle over him like a heavy blanket, grief mixing with shock, and when he looked up, Dakota was watching him with steady, unreadable eyes, as if awaiting judgment. And in that long moment, Elias realized he was standing at a crossroads. Anger, despair, confusion all battled inside him. But beneath it all was something else, a sense that fate had twisted the road for a reason he could not yet see. With a slow exhale, Elias nodded for Dakota to come inside, offering the hospitality he'd prepared for someone else, and the giant ducked under the doorway, filling the room like a living mountain, his presence altering the house as if shifting its spine. And as they sat, Elias silent, Dakota respectful, the rancher felt a strange, uncomfortable truth settling over him. His life had just changed, ripped from its tracks and set on a new, unpredictable path, and he didn't know if he should fear it or welcome it. But he sensed one thing clearly: something enormous, something dangerous, something extraordinary was beginning right there in that dimly lit room. And as night wrapped itself around the ranch and coyotes cried in the distance, Elias Rawlins realized that the mail-order bride he'd waited for hadn't arrived, but destiny had, wearing the body of a warrior twice his size, carrying secrets that would turn his world upside down, and pushing him toward a future more wild, more dangerous, and more transformative than anything he had ever imagined. A future that would force him to confront his past, his enemies, his beliefs, and the very land beneath his boots. A future that would soon test him in ways he'd never been tested. And to everyone listening to this story, if you want to see where this wild tale goes next, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Chapter 2 is where everything explodes into danger, destiny, and a partnership that will rewrite both men's lives forever. The sunrise crept over the Rawlins ranch like a slow-burning fire, casting long amber shadows across the dusty yard as Elias stepped out onto the porch with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the giant Apache warrior who now sat by the corral, sharpening a stone blade with the patience of someone who had never known fear. And Elias couldn't help but study him. Dakota, Clara's protector, the stranger fate had delivered instead of the bride he'd begged heaven for, because the man was not only enormous, he carried himself with the calm weight of someone who understood death as intimately as most men understood hunger. The morning air hummed with quiet tension as Elias walked down the steps, unsure of how to speak to a man who had traveled on foot for hundreds of miles, out of a promise made to a dying woman. And Dakota merely glanced up with eyes dark as volcanic glass, nodding once in acknowledgement without pausing his slow, rhythmic sharpening, the sound of stone scraping against stone filling the silence between them. Elias cleared his throat and said he was riding into town to get answers about Clara, about the outlaws who'd taken her, about the slavers who thought they could stain the West with their filth. And Dakota studied him a long moment before standing, his full height blocking out the rising sun like a monolith carved from earth itself. And he said simply, "I will go," in a tone that left no room for argument. Yet Elias tried anyway, explaining that White Mesa, the nearest town, wasn't friendly to Apaches, especially giants capable of making grown men run for cover. But Dakota only gave him a look that said danger didn't frighten him, and neither did the prejudice of small-hearted men. And Elias, realizing the futility, saddled his horse while Dakota walked beside him on foot with long, unfaltering strides, easily keeping pace as they made their way across the open plains. The ride into town was quiet except for the occasional hawk circling overhead, and Elias found his thoughts drifting to Clara, imagining the tragedies she endured in those final days, feeling guilt twist like a knife inside him. Guilt for not being there, guilt for dreaming of a future that never had the chance to begin. And beside him, Dakota seemed to sense the storm of emotion, saying in his deep, gravel-smooth voice that Clara had spoken highly of Elias, had believed him to be a good man, and that her final thoughts had been of the hope she saw in the letters he sent her. Elias clenched the reins, swallowing hard, feeling emotions he hadn't allowed himself since burying his brother after a raid tore their land apart years earlier, and he wondered how fate had the cruelty and the kindness to take one hope from him only to replace it with something he didn't yet understand. This warrior, this mountain of a man who walked with honor but carried the ghosts of 1,000 battles in his silence. When they reached White Mesa, the reaction was immediate. Dozens of heads whipping around, hands hovering near gun belts, whispers spreading like wildfire, parents pulling children inside as Dakota strode through the main street with an unshakable calm that made Elias nervous, because fear made men stupid, and stupidity often led to violence. But Dakota seemed entirely unbothered by the wide eyes and trembling hands around them, focusing solely on Elias as the rancher led him to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Colton, a broad man with a thick mustache and a temper like a short fuse, stepped out, one hand already on his revolver as he barked at Dakota to step back. But Elias quickly explained the situation, showing Clara's letter, describing the outlaws, the slavers, the attack, and as the sheriff read, his expression hardened, not with empathy but embarrassment, because it turned out White Mesa had known about the bandits operating near the border for months and had done nothing, partly out of fear, partly out of apathy, and Elias felt his anger ignite. Dakota, sensing the shift in mood, stepped closer to the sheriff, looming with an intimidating presence, and in a voice low enough to seem calm, yet sharp enough to cut bone, he said, "Where are the men who sold her?" And the sheriff, nervous and sweating now, admitted they'd received word that the slavers were regrouping near the Black Canyon, preparing for another raid, possibly on a ranch near. Elias felt his blood freeze when Colton said the name. Rawlins Ranch's land, his home, the place Clara had dreamed of reaching, now marked for destruction by the very men responsible for her death. Fury exploded in Elias's chest, and he said they were leaving immediately, that he'd defend his ranch with everything he had. But Dakota placed a massive hand on his shoulder, not stopping him but grounding him, saying, "Not alone," with a quiet conviction that felt like a promise sealed in iron. The ride back was faster, tense, filled with dust and pounding hooves as Elias raced ahead on horseback, and Dakota ran beside him like a force of nature, tireless, unstoppable. And when they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, Elias's worst fears came alive. Smoke rising from the barn, several armed riders circling his property like vultures, looking for valuables, horses, anything they could steal before burning what remained. Rage surged through Elias like wildfire, but before he could charge down the hill, Dakota stepped forward, lifting his stone blade and gripping it like an extension of his own arm, his eyes going sharp and predatory. And in that moment Elias realized the quiet, noble giant he'd invited into his home was also a warrior forged in a world of danger, a man capable of becoming a storm when forced to defend what mattered. The battle that followed was not a battle at all, but a swift, brutal reckoning. Dakota moving through the outlaws like a ghost of vengeance, disarming, disabling, overwhelming them with precise, terrifying efficiency, while Elias, fueled by grief and fury, took down the stragglers with the accuracy of a rancher who'd spent his whole life shooting coyotes off his land. When the final outlaw fled into the canyon, with Dakota sprinting after him and Elias catching his breath amidst the settling dust, the rancher realized something profound. Fate had not robbed him of a future, it had delivered him a protector, an ally, a brother forged not by blood but by the twist of destiny. As Dakota returned, dragging the last outlaw back alive for questioning, Elias looked at him not with fear or confusion but with respect and something deeper, trust, because this giant who had arrived as a messenger for a dying woman had now become the guardian of everything Elias still had left. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the land in copper and shadow, Elias turned to the unseen audience of listeners, those hearing this story unfold, and told them that this was only the beginning, that the partnership between a grief-stricken rancher and a warrior twice his size was about to reshape the desert itself. And if they wanted to witness the dangers, the secrets, the battles, and the bond that would grow between these two unlikely brothers, they needed to subscribe right now, because the next chapter would take them into the heart of the frontier's darkest truths, where enemies multiply, legends awaken, and the line between survival and sacrifice becomes thin as a whisper in the wind.